So the anti-sexual violence movement began in this country more than 40 plus years ago. However, I'd like to share with our North Carolinians that I believe the anti-sexual violence movement started well before we were documenting it. What we know in this country is that when slaves were brought to this country, one of the ways that we were able to keep families, primarily men, in line were by sexually assaulting and forcing women to have sex for whatever the needs were to be met. And so there are early pioneers like Ida B. Wells, Rosa Parks, who I believe were very involved, but I also think it's important that Sojourner Truth, who is one of the people I look to, who was very clear when she had to make a decision between voting rights and women's rights, when she spoke her beautiful epithet of "Ain't I a woman?" I believe that that's where we can start to mark history, recognizing that sexual violence, primarily sexual violence aggressed towards women, that work began there. That's important to me when we talk about a social justice framework, because while the history of 40 plus years ago in this country is very important. We established rape crisis centers, we established funding, and many people will point to the first woman, who I actually believe was here in Illinois, needed a sexual assault advocate, which we didn't have that word then. She was sexually assaulted and was asked to leave all of her clothes for evidence. And at that time is when communities began to galvanize to ensure that if a woman, at that time we were only talking about women, were sexually assaulted, that they wouldn't leave the hospital without their clothing, that they would leave with dignity and respect, meaning all of those basic needs would be met so that they wouldn't feel the continuation of the perpetration once leaving the hospital and evidence is collected. While that is absolutely pivotal in our history in the sexual violence movement, I believe all points of history are recognized and should be recognized and discussed to ensure that we are ending sexual violence and addressing victim services in all sectors of our community. So I believe pointing to both the history in this country, but the history of the anti-sexual violence and the women's rights movement are both points that is equally important to me when we talk about the ways in which we do our work in the anti-sexual violence movement. And that movement, again, has now over 1,300 rape crisis centers throughout the country. As I mentioned, every state and U.S. territory, including the District of Columbia, have a state coalition who work on advocacy, policy, as well as direct services and intervention and prevention. And so all of that culminates to, I believe, what brings us to today. And I believe today we are going back to our natural history and looking at what needs does every survivor need, but also what needs does every community need to ensure that we're preventing sexual violence from the first time of perpetration. We want to ensure that we're ending any perpetuation of violence in our culture. So right now, at this point in history, we're talking about what is a culture of sexual violence? What's rape culture? How are we as a community, as a society, globally addressing sexual violence, or how are we not addressing sexual violence? And both of those questions have to be asked. We also have to ask the question, what is rape and who is raping? And then that helps us understand what our work looks like directly to impact and change the culture here in the U.S., but also globally.